predatory species of humans beyond the ice wall? You're telling me Richard Constantine conquered the lands within the ice wall because he was running from what was on the outside?
Look, I told you, outside the ice wall, in the outer lands, there are hundreds of other continents, countries, land masses. The ancestral lands are where our conquerors came from, but the land of Panthea is who they were running from.
Panthea?
Not exactly the place you want to book a family vacation, to say the least, but look, it's a dark world, allegedly located on the furthest outskirts of all lands, outside the perimeter of our sun, which can give you some insight into just how, kind of intimidating these people actually are. We're talking about a group of humans with profound genetic differentiations based on their environment. Their retinas are entirely geared toward nocturnal vision. They have zero sunlight. They've evolved into borderline psychic levels of environmental awareness, okay? If one of these things wanted to hunt you and your family down, you'd never even see it coming.
So, what happened? Why were the ancestral families running from the Pantheon? What happened? Why were the ancestral families running from the Pantheon?
At some point several centuries ago, the ancestral families took a routine expedition looking for new lands. Unfortunately, on this expedition, they unknowingly arrived at Panthea. As I understand it, the Pantheans had spotted their ship long before they hit the shore, okay, and they were stalking them. The entire crew was ravaged moments after arriving. The Pantheans unalived all but one of the crewmates. Okay, they are far from ignorant. If anything, their levels of intellect are far beyond what we can even fathom due to their lack of a cognitive ability to feel sympathy. They realized wherever this ship had come from was an abundant new source of food. They searched the ship inside and out, found the crew's maps, and forced the one remaining crewmate to steer the ship back to the ancestral lands. As I'm sure you could imagine, this marked a new age of chaos. Within the ancestral lands, they didn't even know what hit them. At this point, Pantheans had officially invaded the ancestral lands. Villages were being ravaged and feasted upon in the middle of the night, and by sunrise, they were nowhere to be seen. But the Pantheans weren't satisfied with feasting on the common folk, okay? They wanted to locate and exterminate the higher authority, right, to kind of take hold of this newfound territory. And so the ruling families, right, the Vanderleys, the Constantines, took notice of these villages being ravaged. They began sending out fleets of men to patrol and look for this mysterious threat. Well, as you could imagine, those fleets of men never returned, except for one young man who'd allegedly came back to the Constantines' castle in the middle of the night in a horrific state of shock and asked to speak to Richard Constantine himself about what he encountered in the villages. And, due to the nature of the situation, the guards granted him access to enter Richard's quarters. Richard, looking at him with a frighteningly stern expression, says to the young man, "You've abandoned your fellow men. I suppose you've come to me bearing 20 lives worth of insight." The young man swallows his fear and says, "Sir, listen, I'm afraid we've got quite a problem on our hands here." He goes, "I saw men, groups of them, but they were not like us. They were monstrously featured, tall, pale," he says, "sir. Their eyes were bright white." And at that point, Richard's expression kind of shifted from frustration to a look of fear nobody had ever seen him show. See, Richard Constantine, although never having encountered Panthea himself, he'd heard stories, what he thought was folklore, from his ancestors about these people who lived in the dark lands. He was able to put two and two together based on the young man's description, and he knew without a doubt that they did not stand a chance. And in a state of panic, he says, "Young man, go alert the Council of Navigation. We sail at dawn. And for the love of God, whatever you do, stay inside until sunrise." It was at this point that these higher-ups, the ancestral families, would sail from the ancestral lands and discover the ice wall as well as the lands within it, or what we all know as our modern world.
My God, that's why they collapsed all the exit passages. It wasn't to keep us in, it was to keep them out. So what happened to the ancestral lands after the Pantheans invaded and the royal ancestral families fled?
Look, I don't know if you want to go there, man. It's really just a dark era.
I need to know. I'm in too deep. What happened to the poor souls left behind?
Look, the Vanderleys, the Constantines, they fled because they had to. In fact, humanity's preservation very much depended on it. Okay, it was either sit there and fall to the rulership of Panthea or flee and survive.
How do you leave your own people behind, knowing what those things were, knowing what they do to them?
Look, survival isn't always pretty, okay? If the ancestral families didn't flee, we would not be sitting here today. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Look, the years that had followed for the ancestral lands were, my God, man, right? You have to understand the kind of calculated nature of the Pantheans to truly understand why they did what they did. These people are not like us. They are a primitively savage, yet unprecedentedly intellectual derivative of the human genome.
What did the ancestral lands look like under Panthean rulership? Just tell me. You're telling me these people from Panthea bred with us,
Look, as these royal families were busy discovering and conquering the lands within the ice wall, or what we now know as our modern world, the population they'd left behind in the ancestral lands weren't so lucky. I mean, the people of Panthea were just using their distorted physical and intellectual advantages to turn what was a thriving civilization into a kind of just dystopian matrix they could feed off of. Which is why I really want you to understand, I mean, sure, the royal families abandoned their people, but I mean, look, they were saving humanity. They gave us another chance.
What did the ancestral lands look like under Panthean rulership? Just tell me.
The Pantheans did what they're biologically wired to do. They strategically used the population as a means to their long-term survival. Look, first they ridded the population of all men, right? They saw no use for them as they'd pose nothing but competitive and rebellious energy. And so the remaining female population would kind of allow them to create something of a self-regulating system, as they'd be able to reproduce with them, kind of for lack of better terms, generating an unlimited source of dietary aid.
No. Lord have mercy.
I'm telling you, man, I really don't like talking about it. You know, this particular part of the story I'd typically just brush over, but, you know, this was how you get the half-blood Pantheans.
Hybrids. You're kidding me.
I'm so serious. These were the offspring of a Panthean and standard human, you know, most of which obviously only made it as far as into the digestive system of the Panthean oligarchs that were running this matrix. But what people fail to realize is that many of these hybrid offspring would eventually migrate to the inner lands within the ice wall, or, you know, our lands.
Come again?
I mean, it wouldn't be a far reach to say there are people walking amongst you to this day.
Of Panthean descent.
Exactly.